Hello everyone, welcome back. This is alrav from Quebec, Canada, the author and creator of Alcatraz the Protector / Alcatraz le Protecteur. And for today's video, I'll be talking about the process of French traduction and localization in general. So for anyone out there who are interested in reading stories across multiple languages, or for any creators who are interested in translating their work, this video is for you. So let's get right into the topic. Now here's a variety of different examples. For instance, in the United States, there's been this magazine known as Heavy Metal, which was one of the first exposure for Americans to franco-belgian creators. This was the English translation of a magazine in Europe known as Metal Hurlant. And yes, this is how you're supposed to pronounce it. Metal Hurlant, Metal Hurlant, Metal Hurlant. Anyway, if you were to translate Metal Hurlant into English, it would be something like loud metal or screaming metal, which makes no sense and is kind of silly. So the English version simply translates it to heavy metal, which is more than appropriate enough. So there are many different examples of how the localization process into the French language can result in the titles of the magazines and IPs themselves being changed, as well as the name of the characters. For instance, in France, or France as you're supposed to pronounce it, there has been many instances of manga / anime being brought over there, and some of which have had the worldwide localization. For instance, the manga / anime Hokuto no Ken was brought to the United States as Fist of the North Star, which is a great sounding title for the martial arts root behind the character. However, in France, this approach was changed for something different, so it became Ken le Survivant, which again, all these titles are different from one another, but they all convey the same meaning and purpose. So overall, this is one instance of an IP that has been translated worldwide and with great success. Another example of that is UFO Robo Grandizer. This is a spin-off of Mazinger Z, which is the precursor to all the modern giant robot and such. In France and Quebec, it was brought over as Goldorak. Why this brand new name? Probably because if UFO Robo Grandizer was pronounced in French, it would be something like UFO Robo Grandizer, which is again kind of silly and absurd. So that's why for the French localization they took the liberty to create a brand new title, which is why a Goldorak was used, and it's a great name overall. Another example is City Hunter. This title is shared between both the American and the original Japanese version. If you were to translate it into French, it would sound like Chasseur de Ville, which is again a little silly and weird. So that's why for the localization in France, they took the liberty to create a brand new name for this particular localization. So it became Nicky Larson. It sounds weird at first, but it is a name for the protagonist of the French localization, and it had its own charms to it. And to give you my point, there's even been a live action film based on the Nicky Larson version of City Hunter. So here's something interesting for you to check out. Now for a counter-example, the French localization usually can sometimes change the titles of the books, the magazines themselves, as well as the name of the characters. But there are some instances in which this approach simply doesn't work, and I'm going to show you one example of that, Batman. If you were to translate it into French, it would sound like L'homme chauve-souris. So as you can probably imagine, the problem with the French translation is that not only it sounds weird and silly, but also it is overly long, and if you are to edit out the dialogues and text of a comic book in the French version, it has the potential to disrupt all the dialogue balloons and narration boxes out there already. So this is one of those instances where it is simply better to use the original English name and keep it as it is. Now, of course, the reality is that when an original work is translated from one language to the next, most of the time it is outsourced to different companies and localizations, who in turn will take their own shares of liberties here and there to make sure that it sounds good in the translated language. Sometimes the end result can be good, other time it's bad, and sometimes it can create masterpieces such as the translation of the Sega Genesis / Mega Drive game Zero Wing, which is notorious for being so bad that it's good. There's been a bunch of internet memes about how broken the intro sequence was, and it became a source of memes and parodies on the internet. With that being said, if you are creators who are interested in translating your own comic books or novels into French, I did the experience myself, since French is my first language and English is my second language that I learned in parallel over my love for comic books when I was a kid. And there are translation tools online that helps to speed up the process, but I think these translation tools are better used in combination with sufficient knowledge of the language in which you want to translate your work into. The advantage of doing the translation yourself as opposed to outsourcing it does give you the opportunity to make it more accurate and true to the original, while also taking the necessary liberties here and there. But one of the downside of it is that it will take some extra works, but sometimes it is better to do it yourself than to outsource it to different companies or localizators who may or may not do the original work justice. Now, on a final note, if you are to translate your own comic book by yourself, one thing that's for sure, you want to keep as much of the original dialogue balloons and narration boxes as the same as in the original, and make sure that your writing fit into them. This is why for the first issue of Alcatraz, I decided to not use any of the traduction tools so I could make the translation accurate. There are some particularities that are different between languages, so for instance, things such as the swearing. In the English, swearings is very commonly known among the English speaking crowd, but French people have different ways of swearing in general, and these can differ greatly between the French as seen in France and the French seen in Quebec, which has its own specific type of swearing. So for the French version that I've made, I've actually used the Quebec version of the swearings, which was kind of hilarious to implement into the story itself. So if you haven't checked out my comic book already on Substack, the first issue is free as always in both English and French, alongside its blog comics companion. Well, you should be in for a treat, especially if you are aware of the language, or even if you're just moderately curious about what it would sound like. And that's what it takes to translate an English comic or novel into French. With that being said, thanks for watching. As always, let me know what you think in the commentary section below. look forward to all the Alcatraz the Protector / Alcatraz le Protector stuff on my Substack. The links are available on the description below or on my channel's page. A second issue of this series is coming out next year. And with that being said, again, thanks for watching, and we'll see one another very soon. Enjoy the reading.